think we can be sure that God's at work, whether we see it all the time or not. I was giving Kurt a hard time last week about taking all this vacation time since Deb and I moved over here, because I used to, years ago, I would have Kurt preach for me, and now he's paying me back. But I thought he was just doing a little payback, but I think what he did was look at the weather forecast, and so it was going to be cold today. So he thought he'd stay home and be warm. So Kurt, if you're listening, I hope you're nice and warm. Well,
oh, Dave, you'll read your thing.
oh, they can't hear me with this one?
It doesn't, no, that there goes out.
Okay, so
Sorry about
all
that.
those people out there in the vehicles didn't hear me? I can't remember it, so. I don't even know if it's turned on.
I don't, probably not. On the side. There you go. The light's on anyway.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, now you can hear me?
Yeah.
It's on.
Okay, well, yeah, Kurt and I do share some things. Neither one of us is very technologically oriented, so. Kurt has been sharing some thoughts about Abraham, and I thought, well, he told me I could do something with that, and I think he's looking at some different segments of Abraham's life and how God used him, and I just want to take a big picture look at Abraham this morning, and I want to tie that into how we as God's people, especially God's people in America at this time, how we're managing to, I hope, stay faithful in times that we really don't understand what's going on. I mean, the church in America looks a lot different today than it did when I was growing up. When I was growing up, we had Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening, 2 weeks of vacation Bible school. You went to church camp and youth group and kids choirs and all kinds of things going on. And the church has shifted from what I knew growing up. But sometimes I have to remind myself what I knew about the church as I was growing up. Other people were saying, well, the church has shifted from when I was growing up. You see, the church in America, we're going through some changes. Some of them I think we've brought on ourselves. Some of them I think that, whoa, this is good. I didn't know Kurt got candy when he preached. But as things change, I think sometimes God is at work just helping us as his people remember our goal is not to have an organization or an institution. Our goal should be to have a body that comes together to worship and honor God and lives day by day our faith in our communities. So I want to look at how God is at work amongst us by looking at Abraham and what God was able to do with Abraham. Now over the years, I've known some men and women who I would consider spiritual giants. You can probably name some in your own minds, people, men and women that you know who are just seem to be great, faithful people. Some of them from this congregation, some of them from congregations here in Morgan County, some of them from other places. And when I was younger, I just assumed those people had been spiritual giants all their lives. But I find out that's not the case. In fact, we're going to look at one man this morning who we consider a spiritual giant, but he wasn't always a spiritual giant, and that's Abraham. But I have learned that what God does, he doesn't choose people and say, there's a really good spiritual person I want on my side. God chooses people and grows us into those spiritual giants. God chooses men and women and says, be faithful to me, be obedient to me, and I will bless your life and I will use you. Quite often I think we look at men and women and think that somehow God has recruited, kind of like football and basketball and baseball does. Oh, we've got to get the best players on our team. God's not looking for the best players. God's looking for men and women who will be faithful and obedient. And he'll make the team. He'll make the team. So I want to talk about Abraham, and I want to go to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. And take a look at how Paul is looking back at Abraham. He summarizes Abraham's life in Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to look at verses 8 through 12 as he talks about Abraham as the father of our faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 12. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. That does tell me that Abraham was a real man. He went someplace he didn't know where he was going. He's going to have to stop and ask for directions, probably. Anyway, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. If you go back to Genesis, I can move around with this can. Okay. If you go back to Genesis and read about Abraham, we find that he was not a deeply spiritual man. He lived with his father. He moved around with his father. But even after God called him, Abraham had some faults. He had some issues that he had to contend with, and that God was going to have to work out some rough spaces in him. But the one thing that Abraham did was he took God at his word. He obeyed God. What he knew about God, he was obedient to. Now, I don't know about you guys who are here, who might be out there listening, but do you know how dangerous it would have been to tell your wife to pack up? We're going someplace. I don't know where, I don't know how to get there, and I don't know when we're going to get there. Do you know how dangerous that would have been for that man? I mean, I don't know a whole lot about Sarah, and we're told that her faith grew too. But how many of us would tell our wife, let's pack up the house, the movers will be here tomorrow morning, don't know where we're going, don't know where we're going to live, don't know how long it's going to take us to get there, we're just going to go, because God told me to. Well, I don't know. I did hear a story once about a couple had been married for a generation, or for decades, 60 or 70 years, and somebody asked them, did you ever think about divorce? And the wife said, never thought about divorce. Murder, yes. Divorce, no.
Get it with the mics so they hear you out there.
Well, I thought they heard me off this one.
You gotta be both of them, Steve.
You gotta have both of them together? Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they can hear you out there.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking that Sarah might have been in that same boat at that time. And Abraham was obedient to God. I don't know how he did it, how he convinced Sarah, but he basically said, this is what God said, this is what we're going to do. And as I pointed out, Abraham was not a spiritual giant at this point. God had communicated to him. God had said, this is what I want you to do. God had chosen him to be the beginning of this nation through which he would bless the entire world, and God told him that. I don't think Abraham understood all those things, but he took God at his word. Over in Acts chapter 7, we have another, I don't want to call it a version, but another telling of this story. If you know your history of the early church, Stephen was sharing his message with the Jews. And in Acts chapter 7, we have his summary of the Jewish history. And unfortunately, at the end of chapter 7, when he finished, the Jews stoned him because they didn't like the words he shared. But in Acts chapter 7, beginning verse 2, he gives us a little bit more insight into what was going on here. He says, he's talking about Stephen. He said, to this he replied, brothers and sisters, or brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. Leave your country and your people. God said, and go to the land I will show you. So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After the death of his father, God sent him to this land where you are now living. God appeared to him and said, here's what I want you to do. So Abraham was obedient. He did what God asked him to do. He went. That, in my mind, took a tremendous amount of faith. Faith that I wonder if I could even match. Fortunately, God has not called me to do that. But God has called me to do other things, just the same as He's called you to do other things in the life in which we live. He's called us to be faithful, to be obedient to Him. And when we think about where the church is in America, I think one of the biggest challenges for us, especially in this day and age, but in every age, is to be faithful and obedient to God. Now, I would like to see things change at higher levels in our government and in our society. I'd like to be in charge of some things so I could straighten some things out, I think. Most likely I just mess them up even more. But that's not what God has called me to do. God hasn't called me to be the President of the United States or to be in Congress, thankfully, or to be in Congress or any of those places. But He has brought us here. He's brought us together. And God says, I have work for you to do. I don't understand all of it. I don't know what it is. The question is, am I prepared to be faithful to God? The way Abraham was. In Romans chapter 4, Paul talks again about Abraham. We get a little bit more insight into Abraham's relationship to God and his obedience to God. In Romans chapter 4, we're going to look at two verses, verse 3 and verse 5. Romans 4, verse 3 and verse 5. Because this is where Abraham is tied to you and I. Paul says in Romans 4:3, what does Scripture say? Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And in verse 5, however, to the one who does not work but trusts God, who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness. You see, there's a link between Abraham and us. It's not just that Abraham was the father of the Jewish nation, but Paul tells us Abraham is the father of all who believe the way Abraham did. And God credits our belief the same as He did with Abraham. He said, Abraham, you believed. You put that faith in action. I'm crediting that to you as righteousness. Now that's because Jesus Christ died on the cross that God is able to do that. But you and I are descendants of Abraham from a spiritual perspective. And when we do the same thing in the circumstances in which God has placed us, God blesses us the same way He did Abraham. He credits to us the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And we are in the same place as Abraham. So Abraham took God at His word. The same God that you and I are here worshiping and honoring today. And He expects the same thing from us, that we will take God at His word in the circumstances in which we live, in the circumstances in which He has called us. And we can be thankful, especially us guys, that God hasn't told us to pack the moving van and move out. I hope He never tells us that. I'm pretty sure some of the things that you and I may deal with, we might say it might be easier to do that. He may challenge us in other ways. But He calls us to trust Him the same way that Abraham did. Now, if you know the life of Abraham, and you can read about that in Genesis, as I said, Abraham was not a spiritual giant the day God called him. When God appeared to him in Mesopotamia, Abraham didn't stand up and say, I am going to be the father of a great nation, I'm a great man of faith. Abraham's life went through some very interesting experiences. Abraham got himself into some real messes when he tried to step outside of what God wanted him to do. There are some very interesting circumstances in his life. How he lied, how he got himself mixed up with other women and other kids, and part of that at the urging of his wife. He listened to her instead of God. That got him into some trouble. I'm not going any farther with that statement. But Abraham, his faith grew over time. God used the circumstances of his life. God used the decisions and the choices that he made. Some of them not good. But God used those to shape his dependence and his faith and his trust in God. One of the times Abraham went down to Egypt, and his wife must have been very beautiful, a little bit like my wife. I have to say that so I don't get too much trouble. But she must have been a very nice looking woman, because he went down to Egypt and he said, now look, they might find you very attractive, and we're going into Egypt, and if they find you very attractive, they may say, hey, if her husband was dead, we could take her as a wife. That didn't seem to suit Abraham very much. This is the man who packed up everything, told his wife they're leaving, he didn't know where he was going, and he didn't know when they were going to get there, and he's afraid, or he's not willing to trust God with Pharaoh. See, one of those situations that you and I find ourselves in at times. We trust God in some great arena, and then we come to another circumstance and we don't have that same level of trust in God. Somehow the bottom has fallen out. And so he asked Sarah to, just tell him a white lie, because they were related. And he said, well, we'll tell Pharaoh that you're my sister. Well, that was sort of true with how they did their family lineages. But it got him into some trouble, because Pharaoh found out from God that Abraham's sister was really Abraham's wife. And Pharaoh wasn't too happy about that. Now, Abraham must have been good at this. He did it twice, and then his own son Isaac did that too. Followed in his dad's footsteps. Same kind of circumstances. And we find out, I haven't really been able to understand the meaning of this, but we're told, I think it was Abimelech, looked out his window and saw Isaac sporting with Rebekah. Don't know for sure what sporting was, but we're not going to go into that today. But it was something that he said, oh, they're not brother and sister. They must be husband and wife. I'll let you use your own imagination there, how that would work out. But you see, Abraham wasn't perfect. He had situations in which the faith that he had in God, he shifted it back to his own, he thought his own intelligence. I'll figure this one out. And he thought he was smarter than God, and his solutions didn't work. God had promised Abraham that he would have a son, and that son was going to come through Sarah. Well, Sarah had a solution. She figured out how this could happen, because it didn't seem that God was doing things the way they wanted them done, or how they thought that should be done. And she brought up a solution to Abraham. And Abraham, instead of saying, that's not what God promised me, we need to listen to what God said. He said, that's a really good idea. I'll do that. And we're still struggling with that decision today. Because Sarah said, hey, I've got this Egyptian servant girl. You take her, get her pregnant. When she has a baby, I'll raise him, and that'll be our son that God promised. Well, that's not what God had promised. But they came up with their own solution. Hey, we're pretty clever in this. And it never worked out. Eventually, Abraham sent them away, but God said, I'm going to make a great nation out of Ishmael. Interestingly enough, Muslims trace their ancestry to Abraham through Ishmael. We're still dealing with that mess today, thousands of years later. I can imagine what would happen if some of my mistakes were sticking around for thousands of years. Some of the mistakes I've made probably were that bad. But you see, Abraham took matters in his own hand. And on the one hand, this is a man that packed up and left his homeland, not knowing where he was going, because he trusted God. And yet when God said, I'm going to give you a son, he thought, well, I got to figure out a way to help God here. How many times have you and I done that? Got to figure out a way to help God. See, what had happened was Abraham found himself struggling in the in-between times. You and I are exactly the same way. We trust God at times. We see huge or big events in our lives, and we're faithful and we walk with God. And then the in-between times is when we really struggle with our faith. And that's where Abraham found himself struggling and looking for answers instead of saying, well, God said this is the way it will be. And it's, well, my goodness, it's taken a long time for God to get there. And so we start trying to figure out our own ways to do things that God has said he wants to take care of. And it's in between times when we don't hear the voice of God, or God appeared to Abraham in Mesopotamia, and he's appeared to him at other times, but in those in-between times, Abraham was struggling, and he wasn't willing to stay faithful to God. He tried to figure out his own answers. And that's where you and I think, run into struggles. We come together with God's people. We leave here planning that this week I'm going to be faithful to God. And sometimes it's even before we get home. We might pull out down here and somebody cut in front of us and we get mad and yell at them. We make a gesture to them. We get up on their bumper. We just left church and we've worshiped God and now we're not happy in other things. It's those in-between times that we have to be able to trust God. And it was those in-between times that I think God was trying to work on Abraham and use those situations to develop his faith. You see, there's a word for what was taking place in Abraham's life, and none of us really like that word very well. Patience. Patience. We have to let God do his work in us and in other people and in the world around us. What we think is taking God a long time, God thinks is not taking very long. And we want God to be identified by our time and our decisions and our thinking. God doesn't work that way. I think that's one of the problems with our country. I think that's one of the problems with our culture these days. We don't want to wait on God. We want to tell God how it ought to be. We want to tell God when it ought to be. We want to tell God where it ought to be. And God doesn't work that way. And so our culture is really wandering. We're really unhinged because we want to tell God how it ought to be. Unfortunately, that changes every few minutes, especially in our culture these days when with all the social media, things just seem to change, constantly be changing. We've lost our anchor as a culture and a society, and God wants to be that anchor in that culture. So Abraham was called by God. God worked through the circumstances of his life and taught Abraham patience. It's very interesting to me as you read through the book of Genesis and you see how Abraham just kept going through those cycles of trusting God and then sticking his own thoughts in there and pushing himself ahead himself and messing things up and then trusting God. It's a cycle that I think we're all very familiar with, though. When we trust God and then we slip up and we think we know better, then we learn that, well, I need to trust God. And something else comes along and we just say, well, I'll take care of that. Over time, we see that Abraham came to the point where he did trust God, fully and completely. And even Sarah learned that. And as we're told here in Hebrews chapter 11, even Sarah was convinced that God was faithful because he had promised. When she was 90 years old, she had a baby. Now, how's that for a promise from God? Ladies, do you want God to bless you that same way he blessed Sarah? Anybody want to volunteer for that? No, it's just not quite what we expect, is it? And yet, she knew that God was going to keep his promise. And so they saw that come about. And then suddenly, God messed things up. Because he told Abraham, here's what I want you to do. That son that I promised you and I blessed you with in your old age, I want you to go up on the mountain and offer him as a sacrifice to me. Now, Abraham in the earlier chapters of Genesis, and as we've talked about him, would have tried to come up with a way to rationalize around that, or I'm not going to do this, I'll do it this way because I'm sure that's what God meant. But the Abraham who had grown in his faith simply packed up and took Isaac and headed to the mountain. And then when Isaac, who must have been somewhat clever, said, we've got wood, we've got fire, We don't have an animal for sacrifice, Dad. What are we going to do? And Abraham said, I don't know if anybody remembers his answer. Does anybody remember his answer? God will provide. The Lord will provide. You see, he had grown in his faith. And he didn't say, well, that's you, Isaac. You're part of this. He knew that God would provide. And Paul tells us that Abraham had become convinced that because God had promised him and God had given him that son, that even if he put him to death, that God would raise him from the dead because God had made that promise. You see how his faith had come, how far his faith had grown throughout his life. As he trusted God, he learned more and more to trust God. Well, there's one difference that I see, or a very big difference between what God was doing with Abraham and what God is doing with us. You see, God called Abraham. He was the father of this great nation. You and I are a part of this great nation. God doesn't call us to go alone the way he called Abraham. He called Abraham, come out from your father's land. He tells us to gather together. We have God's people to come together. Other people who are God's children because they, like Abraham, believe God, and it's credited to us as righteousness. In the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, and sometimes I think we as God's people forget what Paul has told us in Ephesians chapter 4, chapter 5 about God's people. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 25. There's really two parts to this. I want to look at the second part. The first part is equally important. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. Here's the part I want us to look at. For we are all members of one body. And in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 30, Paul says, for we are members of his body. God called Abraham as the first of the nation. He called him out alone. He does not expect you and I to walk faithfully with him alone. We are members of one body. We are members of his body, of the body of Jesus Christ. We don't have to stand alone. We can stand together. The church is only as strong as you and I are. You ever stop thinking about that? The church is only as strong as I am or you are. We're not a perfect body. We're not without our faults, without our struggles, without our challenges. But together, as God's people, we are strong because we are what God wants us to be. And when we come together with that faith that God has developed within us, as he developed faith in Abraham, well, Jesus told Peter, the gates of hell can't stand against the church. Why is the church struggling in our world today so much? It goes all the way back to that issue of faith. It goes back to that issue of not trusting God, but thinking we got to figure things out. And not realizing or not being prepared to stand together to do God's work. When God's people stand together with that faith that God credits as righteousness, no one can stand against us. William Barclay said this in his commentary on Hebrews: men spend the greater part of their lives putting limitations on the power of God. Men spend the greater parts of their lives putting limitations on the power of God. Well, how many times did you and I do that? Not necessarily intentionally. Barbara shared with us something this morning about the Mennonite missionaries. The power of God is greater than those captors. Now, how God will work through that, I don't know. But much of our thinking is around getting those people free and getting them back, which is a great thing. Have we ever given any thought to what else she shared with us? That the Mennonites are seeing how God is at work in those people's lives, reaching those very people who are their captors. I don't know how that turns out, but I don't want to try to limit God and what he wants to do. In our own lives, each of us have struggles, each of us have issues, none of us is perfect, and yet what has God done with us, and what can God do with us when we let our faith be like that of Abraham? when we simply trust God and are obedient to Him. God doesn't call us to work miracles. God doesn't call us to walk on water. Those are easy. God calls us to some really difficult challenges, to be faithful and obedient to Him. And what our world needs to see today is a church that is faithful and obedient. They don't need to see miracles. They've seen God at work in many ways and often don't want to give God the credit for it. What our world needs to see is you and I, faithful every day, honoring God, glorifying God, and being the kind of people that God has credited Jesus' righteousness to us because we trust Him. That we can do, that the world can see. And that's what changed the world in which Paul lived, in which Peter lived, and the next generations. That's what changed their thinking. It can change our world too. And if nothing else, it'll certainly change the world that each of us lives in. This morning, if you're struggling with those kind of issues, this is a good time to ask the church to pray for you. It's a good time for us to pray together, that God will use us, and that God will do some great things. And together, we'll watch God change our world. Terry, I'm going to turn it back over to you.